It is February 27th, 2025, and I think I just broke the record for how many times I could roll my eyes consecutively while watching this press conference that is going on between UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and US President Donald Trump. So I figured I would take a break from that, hop on, film a video, and look at the overall talks that are happening and also not happening this week because we have quite a lot going on. We have not just the Trump-Starmer meeting, but obviously Trump also met with French President Emmanuel Macron this week. He's preparing a meeting with Zelensky tomorrow. And on top of that, the US and Russia held another very important round of talks today where they focused on restoring normalization and functions with each other's embassies, because that has been a big topic of debate, not just in the last 3 years, but also in the last decade. You also have the fact that the US is really ramping up tensions with the EU specifically right now. We heard Trump's comments about the EU earlier this week, and then we see that Secretary of State Marco Rubio was supposed to meet with the EU's foreign policy chief, but apparently called off that meeting. So we are going to get into all of the latest here in today's video. But just a quick reminder that your support does make my work possible. So if anything in this video resonates with you and you want to sign up as a monthly paid supporter, you can do so right now on my site on Patreon or on Substack. You'll get access to exclusive content there. You can also send a one-time donation over on Buy Me a Coffee, and I will leave all of the links in the description box below. All right, let's get into the latest now, as we had a very important round of talks that took place between the US and Russia over in Istanbul, with reports saying that those talks went on for over 6 hours on Thursday. And if you're wondering why the talks were focused on restoring normal functions at the US and Russian embassies, well, that's because the two countries have expelled diplomats and limited the appointment of new staff at each other's missions in tit-for-tat measures over the past decade. So today's talks focus primarily on conditions for each other's diplomats. So they're talking about things like staffing, visas, diplomatic banking. Not exactly super exciting, but the US State Department did kind of put out that warning before the talk started that, look, we're not talking about anything that is political or security related. And they specifically said that they were not going to be talking about the war in Ukraine. And I know that that's the thing that a lot of people are kind of chomping at the bit, waiting for those talks that are specifically going to be on Ukraine. But we have to remember that the US and Russia have had their relations at historic lows over the last 3 years, but specifically in 2024, that was the lowest of the low when we saw the US and Russia on the brink of World War III under the Biden administration. You had Russia describing relations with the US as below zero. So they are basically having to start at the ground level and work their way up, which means literally starting with 6 hours of talks on, okay, how are we going to make things work with our individual embassies? That's how bad things are between the US and Russia right now. I don't think that a lot of people understand that. And I think that because, someone like Trump is coming in talking about, oh, we're just going to, end the war, resolve everything, do it in 24 hours, it's no big deal. Well, the reality of the situation is that there is a lot more to it than that, and a lot more time that needs to be spent on various meetings just like this one. And this is really a testing ground to see, can the US and Russia work together on the base level, and can they trust each other, right? If they make an agreement, are both sides going to follow through? Because for a country like Russia, that's a very important factor that they are paying attention to right now, because historically, they have been shown time and time again that they cannot trust the West. And I know that Russian President Putin has come out and he said that the current talks have brought him hope, right? That he has hope for the future. And for him to say that, that's a really big deal. But at the same time, we also still have to remember that even as statements like that are being made by the Russian president, that does not mean that the war in Ukraine is coming to a halt. That does not mean that there is a ceasefire. The war is still ongoing, and it is still a very long road ahead. So just some kind of context to keep in mind as we're looking at meetings like the one that was held in Istanbul earlier today. But while the US is talking to Russia, they are not talking to the EU, as you had a planned meeting between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas that was canceled this week due to what was described as scheduling issues, apparently on Rubio's side, because the office of Kallas is referring requests over the reasoning of the cancellation to the State Department. And these tensions really don't come as a surprise when you look at the rhetoric that we've seen from Trump this week, as he openly said to reporters on Wednesday that he plans to impose 25% tariffs on the EU, and he claimed that the bloc was, quote, formed to screw the US. Doesn't exactly sound like he wants to work with them there. There was also a reported internal memo going around the State Department that instructed officials to, when speaking to their European counterparts, focus on two main topics: free speech and migration. In other words, do not talk about the war in Ukraine, future support for the war, or future tensions with Russia, which is interesting because if you're the EU right now, those are the topics you want to be talking to the US about. That's what you're trying to get the US on board with, is more support for Ukraine and a continued war against Russia. The things you don't want to talk about are free speech in the EU and also migration policy. And while that memo was just being reported, that has kind of reflected the shift in rhetoric that we've seen coming from both Vice President J.D. Vance and President Trump when they've been talking about the EU. You saw Vance with his fiery speech before the Munich Security Council, where he was calling out the EU on the topic of free speech. You also have Trump in this position where on Monday, when he met with French President Emmanuel Macron, he was very careful in his rhetoric, right? He was not going to come out and call Putin a dictator. He was not going to call Russia the aggressor. And he was careful in what he said, which is notable for Trump. But clearly, he wants to get on better terms with Russia, so he's going to watch his mouth a little bit there. And from what I was watching on that press conference with his meeting with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, that was about the same. I saw a question there from a reporter who was, saying, hey, you called Zelensky a dictator. Well, Putin actually is a dictator. So how are you going to handle that when you meet with Zelensky on Friday? And Trump just didn't even respond to that. He kind of just sidestepped it and, gave an answer that wasn't really related to it and then said, okay, next question. So we really are seeing, if that memo is to be believed, we are seeing that directly reflected in the way that Trump administration officials are acting and talking right now. And as for that meeting with Macron, while the French president tried to present it in a positive light, anonymous European diplomats who were said to be involved in the talks are telling Politico a different story, with one calling the meeting a waste of time and another saying, we as Europe are in this rather alone right now. And a comment like that just makes me wonder, what exactly did they think was going to happen during these talks, right? Did they think that Emmanuel Macron, of all people, was going to go into the White House and have a heart-to-heart conversation with Trump, and then Trump was going to come out and be like, you know what, you're right, I've got it all wrong. I'm going to stop talking to Russia. I'm going to back Ukraine for as long as it takes because I have been properly brainwashed by this spokesperson from the EU. No. That's not what was going to happen. Anyone in the EU who believed that that was going to happen is clearly delusional. If you pay attention to Trump's statements, the fact that he's literally coming out and he's calling Zelensky openly a dictator, he's calling out Europe. He's saying, you know what, Europe, you handle Ukraine, right? I don't want to do this. I don't want to continue on in my support for a war that we as a whole, not just Ukraine, but that NATO as a whole is losing right now. He's like, why would I want to continue that and hand Russia a victory on the battlefield when I could try to make a deal with them and try to at least get out that way? And then, as for Trump, he would try to make it look like, oh, we figured things out, and basically take what credit he can get for that and make it Biden's war instead of continuing support for that war and then it becoming Trump's war in Ukraine. Now, I will say that Trump's meeting with Starmer has been a little bit friendlier than his meeting with Macron, even as their body language was a bit bizarre when it came to Trump and Macron earlier in the week. But with Starmer, he actually walked out of the White House to go and greet the guy. And I think that could be attributed to the fact that earlier this week, we did have that announcement from the UK Prime Minister that he pledged to increase his country's defense spending to 2.5% of gross domestic product by 2027 and up to 3% within a decade, which is exactly what Trump wants to hear. But I have yet to see any indication that these talks with Starmer are going to lead to any radical change in Trump's policies. Instead, it just feels like a way for the EU and the UK to say, look, we are talking with Trump, right? We're sending our officials to meet with Trump. We're having face-to-face talks. And they see that as important, even if they're not getting what they want, which is a complete change in Trump's policy. Even if they're not getting that, they can still say, well, at least we're meeting with him. And that kind of approach seems to also be the case for Mr. Zelensky, who is set to arrive at the White House on Friday. Now, there's been a lot of back and forth, and I know that I've covered it in multiple videos, so I won't go too much in depth on it, but there has been a lot of talk about this deal that Trump and Zelensky are supposed to sign that would give the U.S. access to rare earth minerals in Ukraine. And I think Trump is acting like this would be an immediate payback, like they sign the deal and then Ukraine turns around and goes, okay, well, here's the roadmap to how you find $500 billion worth of rare earth minerals on our soil. Yeah, not going to work like that. This would be a deal that would take years to fulfill or to lead to any sort of profit from, especially right now with this ongoing war in Ukraine. And that's just to assume that Kiev keeps control of the territory it currently has, and that those lines don't change between Ukraine and Russia. And it's been interesting to see as we've had this back and forth, because now Zelensky is having to come out and kind of save face a little bit by insisting that although the current version of the deal that he and Trump were said to have agreed on, that does not include any future security guarantees for Ukraine. Well, he's referring to it as a framework for a possible deal, saying he just needs to talk to Trump. But the same principle that we saw for Starmer and for Macron also applies to Zelensky. Does he really think that he's going to sit down face to face with Trump and convince him to make any drastic changes in his policy so far? Does he really think that if he sits down, he's going to convince Trump to continue this war, to give Kiev all of the security guarantees that it wants, and then to use this minerals deal as a way to, act like the U.S. is getting some sort of payback that he can then sell to his voters? I think the fact that Trump came out and literally called Zelensky a dictator and said it was time for Ukraine to hold elections, those presidential elections were over a year past due. I think the fact that Trump said that so publicly shows you exactly where he stands. It shows you that he does not want to deal with Zelensky or Macron or even Starmer for that matter. He's much more interested in dealing with someone like Russian President Putin, someone who's coming out and saying, hey, if you want to make a deal, let's make a deal, whether that's minerals in the Donbass, whether that's other various business deals. He's actually coming out and talking about business. And Trump was looking at that and going, yeah, I'd rather have a business deal with you than this other deal with whether it be the EU, whether it be Ukraine, where it is just the US selling security, right? Selling more weapons, selling what it has been for decades now. And I don't know exactly how far we are going to get into sort of this new era or this new shift that we are seeing right now. I don't know how much Trump is going to be allowed to do at the end of the day. Clearly, he has his way of doing things that he is implementing, and to a certain extent, the U.S. establishment is allowing him to do that. I'm very curious to see how far we get with this, because as I was kind of noting earlier, there is a long road ahead when it comes to the US and Russia and their talks and their normalization and an end to the war in Ukraine. We are talking about months and months, if not years, of talks that are going to happen to get to a point where we have full normalization, where the war in Ukraine is over, where Russia feels as though it has the guarantees it needs to not keep going further and to not continue this war on its end. And Trump is going to have to decide on his end how much he wants to commit to, right? Does he want to stick it out in these talks with Russia? Is he fed up and done and frustrated with all of these European officials and with Zelensky? Clearly, he seems to be frustrated right now. That much is clear, but I'm very curious to see how far this is going to go, right? How much progress is going to be able to be made. And then, as I've noted before, where Trump's focus is going to go, right? How things are going to proceed from here. Because we are seeing a lot of progress this week. We're seeing very telling meetings and very telling statements when you've got Trump calling out the EU in the way that he is, when you've got Russia in this position where they're openly holding talks with the US. I do think that progress is being made, but I also think we have to keep in mind that there is a very long road ahead, and that's something everyone should be talking about. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also catch Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.